Some things won't line up no matter how long you stare at them. And that's not because you're sloppy and not because reality is incoherent, but because a part of reality is precisely not the sort of thing that lines up into one more law. And Lonergan names that part of empirical residue, and learning to recognize it is a turning point for realists. Here, our aim today, first, is a crisp account of what the empirical residue is. Second, 3 lenses on it: chance, the individual, and the otherwise, with concrete examples, obviously. Third, how residue sits beside classical laws and statistical laws without being swallowed by either of them. Fourth, why acknowledging residue is not an excuse for laziness, but actually a condition for intellectual honesty and practical wisdom. So let's place this episode in the arc so far, like we did in the previous one. In the first episode, we made the act of understanding visible. In the second, we saw how empirical method aims at understanding with heuristic structures. In episode 3, we climbed to higher viewpoints. And in the last episode, episode 4, we learned inverse insight, the liberating no that denies a misframed expectation. Today's theme is a sibling to that, when explanation reaches its proper limit and you have to reckon with what remains, the residue, without pretending it isn't there. So, what is it? At its simplest, the empirical residue is everything in concrete data that remains individual, random, or otherwise after you've done the proper work of understanding. It's the this here now that your law treats as a boundary condition. It's the convergence of independent sequences that meet and are met by coincidence. And it's not by hidden design either. It's the kind of variation that could be otherwise without violating any intelligible pattern. So that means it's not ignorance in need of one more mechanism. It's better characterized as the sort of more that belongs to concrete situations as concrete. So let's take the 3 angles that we mentioned in turn. So first, remember, the first is the individual. Every classical law speaks universally, and this relation holds whenever the relevant conditions are met. But you never meet a law, you meet this case. This raindrop falls here at this time, hits that leaf, and splashes in a pattern no equation will list term by term. Your law covers the generic behavior. The individual is the unrepeatable instantiation. So in physics, initial conditions and boundary conditions are not themselves supplied by the law. They are taken from the concrete situation. In biology, a trait distribution describes a population. This organism still has its own developmental history. In the classroom, for example, a pedagogical theory can be sound. The student still brings a biography that no checklist can possibly exhaust. The residue is that concreteness. Second, remember chance. Not everything that coincides is connected. An airplane leaves Denver, a thunderstorm builds over Milan, the 2 timelines meet. You can trace each sequence by its own intelligibility, but the meaning of the 2 is a coincidental aggregate, the convergence of independent series. So it's by chance, not because nothing is intelligible, but because the relevant intelligibilities are independent and their interaction, their intersection, is not by itself a further law. So in statistics, you already respect this. You model a process, then treat residual fluctuations as random. You don't chase a hidden mechanism for every little wiggle. You call it chance, right? And to call it chance is not to shrug and go, it's to name a structural feature of concrete process. Third, the otherwise sounds strange, but even when a law holds, many concrete outcomes remain open. A fair die thrown once lands on one face. It might have landed otherwise without violating any law at all. The concrete constrains the space of possibilities. It does not script every unique instance. The otherwise is not a ghostly kind of force, ghost in the machine. It's the mark of contingency in concrete realization. And you can extend that to history and get development, and you begin to feel how multiple possible paths fan out from every single situation. A theory can outline these tendencies. What actually happens, though, is it depends on conditions that might, within the bounds of the same theory, have been different. Now, the first misunderstanding to clear away is fatalism on the one side and rationalism on the other side. Fatalism shrugs. If there's residue, nothing is intelligible. Whereas rationalism insists, if anything escapes my formula, the world must be unintelligible. And both are mistakes. Classical intelligibility is real. Statistical intelligibility is real. And residue is real. Realism means affirming all three. But how does residue sit with the two modes we already know, classical and statistical? Remember, classical laws give you systematic relations, functions, invariants, equations. They describe what must be so given the stipulated conditions. But where do the conditions come from? From the concrete situation, exactly where the residue lives. It's there in that situation. The law doesn't pick the wind gust that buffets the ball mid-flight. The wind does. The law doesn't select the initial phase of an oscillation. The setup does. The law is abstract. Its application is concrete, and application always requires input you do not and cannot derive from the law itself. And statistical laws give you a different kind of generality. They don't say this one must be true, but across many, the relative frequencies will stabilize within bounds. Statistical method accepts that some differences are not systematic. It retains generality by making those differences converge around a norm that cannot be systematically violated. But here too, residue nonetheless remains. A distribution describes a population. The next case still falls where it falls. The fact that frequencies stabilize does not tell you which single raindrop will hit your sleeve. So, residue is not an error bar. It's what makes error bars necessary in the first place. It's what makes initial conditions and boundary conditions real. It's what probabilistic talk is all about. So, that's very high. Let's try to make this more tangible with three brief scenes. So, the first scene. You're modeling pedestrian flow for a city square. Your classical component describes how flow varies with entrance width and obstacles. Your statistical component captures the distribution of arrival times throughout the day. But then the street musician shows up. A child drops an ice cream. A dog barks. A cloudburst starts. None of these are new laws of pedestrian physics, obviously. They're independent sequences that happen to converge here and now. Your model remains valid. The residue is what actually happened at 4:37 p.m. on Tuesday. Maybe we're getting it now. Second scene, genetics. Mendel's ratios laid down classical regularities. Population genetics added statistical structure. Yet, any developmental biologist will add, this embryo is the intersection of countless microconditions, some intelligible, some practically unknowable, and many of them independent. You can give a wide-angle account of morphogenesis and still respect the irreducibly individual course each organism takes. The third scene, finance. A pricing model can be beautifully calibrated. You can even hedge correctly, ideally. Then a once in 40-year coincidence arrives. 2 independent shocks land on the same day. And your desk learns, again, that models live in a world where independent sequences do sometimes converge. The right response is not to pretend your model could have made that exact conjunction inevitable. The right response is to widen prudence and narrow overconfidence. But why does all of this matter for realism? Because realism is a discipline of affirmation, saying yes only to what the evidence warrants, and obviously say no to expectations the evidence undercuts, and say we don't know yet, when that is the actual truth. The residue forces an honest no, a not yet, where a certain intellectual temperament would prefer to say yes, and it's simple. It also matters for development. The residue is not merely a bin of leftovers. It supplies the conditions that let new patterns emerge. Independent sequences intersect. A scheme of recurrence is triggered. A cycle stabilizes and begins to run on its own. Air currents, moisture, temperature meet to produce a storm cell that itself becomes a semi-stable pattern. A handful of separate practices in a lab align just enough to make new technique visible. Once viable, it reproduces. This emergence depends on residue. Novelty is the child of independence. If you hear a theme from episode 4, you should. Inverse insight keeps you from fishing for the wrong kind of explanation. The empirical residue marks the zone where that no often applies. Don't try to smuggle in imaginary forces to save appearance. Don't promote boundary conditions into faux laws. Don't confuse the space of possibilities with a secret script. Let the residue be residue, and then notice how much work that leftover, if you want to call it that, does for real, genuine understanding. If we take that, then what then do you do differently tomorrow if you actually take this seriously, what we're discussing? So, first, write your conditions explicitly. When you state a law, list the inputs that are not delivered by the law. In an experiment, list the initial and boundary conditions as what they are, concrete facts taken from the situation. In a model, list the exogenous variables without hand-waving them into parameters. Naming them is already a practice of realism. Second, separate these intelligibilities. Which processes are genuinely linked and which merely converge? Draw 2 arrows instead of 1 when sequences run independently. Removing phantom links not only prevents superstition, it also clears your sight for the links that actually exist, that are actually there. Third, use probability with discipline. Don't use randomness as a trash can for ignorance. Don't use it as a mystic fog. Use it where independence and contingency are structurally present. Define the population, define the sampling, define the time scale on which stabilization is meaningful. Let statistical law speak where it properly speaks. Fourth, design with safety margins. Engineers already do this. They acknowledge the otherwise by building in tolerance. Loads vary, materials vary, human behavior varies, and we all know that. The safety factor is not a form of pessimism. It's a deference to the way concrete reality actually behaves, sometimes otherwise. Fifth, coach your students or your team to distinguish 3 basic moves. Find the function that really does hold, accepting an ideal frequency where individual cases are open, and letting concrete individual facts stand as facts without forcing them under either banner. The pedagogy here is to feel the difference, not to just reconcile the terms. The sixth, write stop rules. Remember that from the last episode for system hunting. Decide in advance when you will stop adding hidden causes to chaos and noise. Pre-register those rules in research. Bake them into practice in the lab. Articulate them in policy designs. A stop rule is humility written into the procedure itself. Seventh, practice historical thinking. The otherwise is often temporal. If a result depended on a path that could have gone differently without breaking any law, write that down. History, in this strict sense, is not romance. It's actually noting the points where multiple futures were live and one became actual. A common worry, obviously, is that honoring residue will make us less ambitious. The opposite is actually true. When you stop mislabeling residue as mere ignorance, you are free to push hard exactly where intelligibility is available. You commit to careful law finding where there is law to be found. You commit to careful frequency work where there is a range rather than rule. And you commit to careful description where the protagonist is an individual or a unique configuration that will not repeat. Now, let me gather the contrasts that save time in real work. If your phenomenon is truly systematic, the right move is to find the law and tighten its application. If it's truly statistical, the right move is to state the ideal frequency and its credible bounds. If it's truly an individual configuration, the right move is to describe it honestly and identify which of its features travel and obviously which ones simply do not. And if you're not sure, begin by testing independence. Which independent sequences cross? Don't invent a joint mechanism. Name the coincidence and move on. There's also an ethical payoff, and I'm sure many of us are already teasing on this. Misusing explanation to control what is individual breeds violence towards people, towards institutions, towards nature. Accepting residue trains prudence. You don't demand more certainty than the situation can yield. You don't feign less than is available. That virtue protects inquiry from both magical thinking and mechanical dogmatism. But let's just give a little word on language. The residue is not noise. Don't think of it like that. There's a tendency in the pejorative sense. It's the concrete surplus that every abstract pattern needs in order to be applied and extended. It's the soil in which novelty grows. If you keep that metaphor in mind, your tone shifts from exasperation to patience. You stop resenting the world for being concrete. You start working with it as it is. We can turn also the lens inward in our own thinking. Residue is what keeps us from confusing concepts with the realities they tend to talk about. A definition can be flawless and still not touch this person. A theory can be powerful and still not predict the selection. This storm, this conversation that we're having. That is not a failure of meaning. It's a reminder of the layered way intelligence meets the world. Insight into forms, insight into frequencies, and honest acknowledgement of the otherwise. So, let me summarize all of this in 4 sentences that you can carry with you. The first is, the empirical residue is what remains individual, chance, or otherwise after you have done proper explaining. The second, classical and statistical laws are real, but they are abstract. Application always needs concrete inputs that the laws simply do not generate. 3, chance is not a shrug. I don't know. It's the name for convergence of independent sequences, coincidental aggregates that do not constitute a further law. 4th, acknowledging residue is not giving up on understanding. Don't think of it like that. It's how understanding stays realistic and makes room for novel emergence. Let's take all that. Where does the series go next? Having named the residue, the natural next step is to show how order emerges through it, how independent sequences give birth to stable patterns that then become the building blocks for more complex schemes. And that is the province of emergent probability, how development happens in a world that is at once intelligible and otherwise. If that's a topic you want to master in plain language, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. For now, here's a 1-minute practice you can do today. Take a live problem. List the laws you are rightly using, the frequencies you are rightly trusting, the concrete conditions you are not deriving from either. Circle the conditions and ask yourself, which of these are independent? Which are genuine coincidences I should stop pretending to systematize? Where can I widen prudence instead of widening my theory? That little audit is often the fastest path to better decisions. So to close, being a realist, a critical realist, is more than loving facts. It's the discipline of knowing how facts and forms and frequencies all belong together. The empirical residue is not a blemish on intelligibility. It's the space in which concrete life actually happens, and the space through which deeper orders can arise. So honor it, and your thinking will be both truer and kinder.